In this video, I'm going to be reviewing the Firstess CT2050. It is a 7-in-1 welder that is made by YesWelder. And I do want to point out that this is a pre-release beta machine. YesWelder did send it to me to do a review, but they did not pay me for this review, so this review is 100% my honest opinion. This machine will do AC TIG, DC TIG, AC pulse TIG, DC pulse TIG, stick welding, plasma cutting, and the thing that intrigues me the most is not only will it do plasma cutting, but it has a built-in air compressor. So that means there's no need for an external air compressor to do plasma cutting with the Firstess CT2050. This machine will be released as a Kickstarter, and the best place to go for the most current information will be the description of the video. I'll have links to the Kickstarter down in the description, and if you happen to be watching this sometime in the future and the Kickstarter's over with, I'll have links to where you can go to purchase the Firstess CT2050. So I am excited to get my hands on this machine, and I am ready to start welding and cutting with it. But before I start doing that, let's go over what all comes with the Firstess CT2050. The Firstess CT2050's main welding function is TIG welding, so it should be no surprise that it comes with a TIG torch. And the torch seems to be very well made. It has a little ball and socket joint here on the end, and the machine is a high frequency start. You don't have to touch the metal to start the arc, so it has a little switch here on the top. And it also has a dial so that you can adjust the amperage. Along with that torch comes an accessory kit, and it comes with a number 4, number 5, and number 6 ceramic cup. It also has a long and a stubby end cap, and there are 3 different size collets so that you can use most standard sizes of tungsten. There is a nice heavy-duty ground clamp that comes with this machine, and it has a DINS connector on the end. It also comes with a stinger so that you can do stick welding. There's also a gas hose included with the machine. It also comes with this air regulator that I have already installed on the back of the machine. This is a plasma cutting machine, so it does come with a plasma cutting torch. The torch is the same quality as the TIG torch. It's got the same little ball and socket strain relief here on the end. It's also got a trigger guard. And I just want to take a quick look at the consumables, because cheap consumables don't last very long. And I've seen some of these torches that have a ceramic cup on the end. They don't last very long. This is copper. It's got some type of coating on the outside. The tip seems to be heavy duty, as well as the electrodes. So these consumables should last a long time. Of course, we will find out when we start doing some plasma cutting. And last but not least, it comes with this adapter. So not only will it run on 240 volts, but it will also run on regular 120 volts as well. So I've got the Firstess CT2050 set up on my welding cart. Let's plug it in and take a closer look at the screen and see what all it will do. So I'm going to start out right here with the weld modes, and you can see the modes that this has is AC TIG, DC TIG, stick, cut, and cut with compressor. So I think I'm going to start out with the plasma cutter and testing that built-in air compressor and seeing how well it will cut. So first up on the plasma cutter chopping block is this 14 gauge sheet metal that I had out of the scrap bin. And I'm going to start out using the 120 volt adapter. So you can see right here on the input voltage, it says it is 125 volts. I think that's reading just a little bit high. And also when I'm using that adapter, the maximum amperage that it will go up to is 25 amps. So let's try that 14 gauge at 25 amps and see how well it does. And I'd like to point out that this machine does have a pilot arc. That means you do not have to touch the torch to the metal to get the arc started. And it also has this little height gauge right here that keeps the torch at the correct height so that when you drag it across the metal, you'll get the best cut. So here's that cut that I just made on the 14 gauge sheet metal, and you can see there's just a very minimal amount of dross. It did a pretty good job cutting this at 25 amps. Now I've got the machine plugged into a 240 volt outlet. You can see right here the input voltage says 244 and the amperage is still at 25, but now I can go all the way up to 45 on that 240 volt outlet. I can also change the pre and post airflow by pushing the knob in, and now right here you can see it is on post flow, and it's currently set at 10, but the max would be 15 seconds and the minimum would be half a second. I like that 10-second setting, so I'm going to leave it there. Push the knob in one more time, and now it is on the pre-flow air, and it is set at 1 second, but the max would be 3, and the minimum looks like it would be at 0.6. And I like that 1 second setting, and I'm going to leave it there. And I've got that amperage set at 45 amps. Let's try something a little bit thicker, like this 1/8 inch thick steel. And here's that cut that I just made on that 1/8 inch steel, and it looks pretty good. Let's move up to something a little bit thicker, like some 3/8 inch thick steel. So here's that cut that I made on the 3/8 steel. You can see there's a bunch of dross here at the beginning of the cut, and then here toward the end there's not as much dross. That's because I sped up moving the torch. So I'm going to try this again and move the torch a little bit faster, and let's see if we can't get rid of some of this dross. So not much of a difference here. There is a little bit of glob of dross right here, but it didn't really make that much of a difference. So now I've got the thickest piece of metal I could find in the shop, and that is this 1/2 inch thick piece of steel. Let's see how well it will cut it. So here's a close-up view of that 1/2 inch thick steel. And for 1/2 inch thick steel, I think it did a pretty good job of cutting this. So up until now, we've been cutting clean steel. Let's try some dirty old rusty steel. I've got this 1/4 inch thick angle iron. And you can see here, this is where a previous plasma cutter that I was testing at 45 amps failed. It could not cut through this. Let's see how well the Firstess CT2050 will cut through this rusty old angle iron. So here's the cut that I just made on that rusty old 1/4 inch angle iron, and you can see it had no problem going through it. This is from a previous video. A different brand welder at 45 amps could not chew through this angle iron, so the Firstess CT2050 has passed the test on the rusty old angle iron. So I'm really impressed with the Firstess CT2050's plasma cutting capabilities. It cut everything that I threw at it, and I really like that onboard air compressor for 2 reasons. One, it's on board, it's inside that machine, so I don't have to drag around a little pancake air compressor or small little 5-10 gallon air compressor to the job site or a buddy's house. I just take this machine and I've got everything that I need to plasma cut. And the second thing that I'm impressed with this is that the air compressor is very, very quiet. You could hardly hear the thing running, and all in all, this thing gets a big thumbs up on the plasma cutting. So I know what some of you guys are thinking right now. Hey, will that Firstess CT2050, will it work with a CNC plasma table? And the answer is yes, it will. So if we take a closer look at the back of the machine, you can see there are 2 aviation ports. One is for arc voltage. The other one is a control switch and also arc status. And this is all that we need to hook it up to a CNC plasma cutter. And since I used the same aviation connectors on my current setup, all I had to do is make a cable. One end plugs into the plasma cutter and the other plugs into my current setup. And the only modification I had to make, other than making that cable, was I had to put my old 3D printed mounting ring on here, and this is from the Harbor Freight plasma cutter that I used to own. This torch is the same size as the Harbor Freight, and it's all mounted in here and it's ready to go. So now let's try this out and see how well the Firstess CT2050 works with a CNC plasma cutter and that built-in air compressor. So here's that piece of 14 gauge mild steel that I just cut on the CNC plasma, and you can see here it's got nice clean edges. The holes are nice and clean. This is the top side. I'll flip it over here on the back, and you can see it's just as clean on the back side. There is a little bit of dross here and around this hole, but all in all, this did a really nice job cutting 14 gauge mild steel on the CNC plasma. So other than having to make a cable and put a mounting ring on my Z-axis back there, it was pretty much plug and play. The CT2050, it hooked right up to my current CNC plasma table with little to no effort. So I'm getting the Firstess CT2050 set up to do some TIG welding, and I just want to point out that I will be using a foot pedal, and this machine does not come with a foot pedal. So if you're like me and you have to have a foot pedal to TIG weld, this is something that you will have to purchase separately. And I've got my torch all set up, and I've got some 3/32 blue lanthanated tungsten and a number 6 ceramic cup. Okay, so I'm going to start out by doing some AC pulse TIG welding. I have the high side set to 150, the low side set to 100. The frequency of the AC power is set to 85 Hertz. The balance is set to 30%. The pulse is set to 1 time per second at a 75% duty cycle. There will be no slope up or slope down because I'm using the foot pedal. The post flow gas is set to 5 seconds, and the pre-flow is set to a half a second. So I'm going to be welding some 3/16 aluminum. Let's see how well it will do it. And for some reason my camera quit recording in the middle of that pass, but this is what it looks like. That's not bad if you ask me. I could probably use a little bit more practice with my TIG welding, but still, that turned out pretty nice. So now let's try that same 3/16 inch piece of metal, but this time let's put the machine into smart mode, and we will set it here to 3/16 of an inch with the piece of metal laying flat. Looks like it's going to have it set to 160 amps, and it also looks like the machine has turned the pulse off. So let's just compare my settings to what the smart mode does. Okay, and there is what smart mode looks like. That's a little bit better than what I had set up for my manual settings. Let's put these side by side and do a quick comparison. And here are those two welds side by side. The one here on the left is the smart mode settings, and the one here on the right is the manual settings. You can see the smart mode settings are much cleaner. It's a much shinier weld than my manual settings. This one looks grayed out and kind of cloudy, and this one's all nice and shiny. So I would say the smart mode is definitely smarter than me right now. And of course I could use some more practice on my TIG welding, but this isn't bad for this welder. It's doing a really good job on this aluminum. And I want to point out that the smart mode only works on AC TIG. It does not work on any of the other weld modes. It will not work on DC, stick, or plasma cutting. And there's these extra settings over here on the right side. And you can see when I turn smart mode off, these are disabled. And these settings are basically your weld position. This is the position that you will hold the torch while you're welding. And the three settings here are flat, vertical, and overhead. And then the other settings are your thickness of the metal. And you've got 18 gauge, 16 gauge, 14 gauge, 1/8, and 3/16 of an inch. So now let's try some DC TIG. I'm going to put the machine into DC TIG mode, and I'm going to dial the amps down to 105, and then I'm going to set it for no pulse. So we're just going to do some straight up DC TIG welding, and let's see how well it works on some mild steel. And I'm going to start out with some 1/8 inch thick square tube. Let's see how well it will weld these two pieces together. So that's not bad right there. I think I can do a little bit better. Let me make some adjustments on the machine, and I'm going to try this again. A lot of this I think could just be my TIG welding skills are a little rusty. Okay, so that's a little bit better there. I didn't make any adjustments to the machine. It's just me. I'm just a little rusty on TIG welding. Let's try adding some pulse into this and see if it makes any difference. Okay, so that looks a whole lot better. I am using the same pulse settings as I was on the aluminum. The only difference is the high side is 105 amps and the low side is 70. Okay, so this is the thickest piece of steel that I have in the shop. It is a 1/2 inch thick. Let's see how well it will TIG weld. So I took a wire brush to this and cleaned it up so it would show up a little bit better on camera, and I think that's a pretty good job for some 1/2 inch thick steel. Okay, so the only thing left to try out on this machine is the stick welding, and I am not a stick welder, so I asked a buddy of mine to come over here and try this thing out and see what kind of results he could get. And for this test, we're going to be welding that rusty old angle iron that's 1/4 inch thick, and we're going to be using some 6010 1/8 inch rod. So here's what welding those two pieces of rusty old angle iron together looks like using 6010 rod. The CT2050 did a pretty good job, and my buddy actually apologized for this weld, and I don't think it looks that bad at all, especially for somebody that hasn't stick welded in many, many years. So it looks like the Firstess CT2050 can stick weld 1/4 inch rusty old angle iron with no problems. So this has turned out to be an awesome little machine. It has definitely earned a spot here in the Making Stuff workshop. And I've got a really large aluminum welding project that I'm going to be starting later this summer. And I have a feeling that I'm going to be using this welder quite a bit on that project. So the best thing to do is, if you made it this far in the video, just go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because I can't really go into details, but I guarantee you're going to like this project. So there's my review of the Firstess CT2050. It's a 7-in-1 welder. It's like having a little fabrication shop in a box. It'll do the AC TIG, DC TIG, stick welding, and plasma cutting, and it even worked great on my CNC plasma table. And remember, this is going to be initially released as a Kickstarter, so the best place to go for the most current information will be the links that I'm going to put down in the description. So check out there first, and remember, if you're watching this in the future and the Kickstarter's over with, I will have everything down there in the description on where you can go to purchase the Firstess CT2050. So I hope you liked the video. If you did, please give me a big thumbs up, and if you aren't a subscriber, please consider subscribing and ringing that bell so you don't miss any upcoming Making Stuff videos. And thanks for watching.